Good morning, and I want to thank Tim Bush, I want to thank John Meyer, I want to thank Father Spitzer. It's a real honor to be here. I've spoken in front of, 100,000 people, but you're a bit of an intimidating crowd because you're so invested in these topics, and you know so much. And so I hope I can offer you something that's useful, that might be a new twist on what you know, or maybe even something new, which would be kind of stunning. I want to tell you how much I hate it when I give a presentation that promises a response, let alone a reasoned response, to a subject like the sexual revolution, because we know it is not itself a reasoned revolution. The people who invented it didn't invent it out of reason. But then I thought to myself, well, maybe I've been defining reason all wrong. Maybe I'm struggling in terms that are too empirical, too individualistic. Maybe I've forgotten that there's things that can be known for sure, beyond science, and even beyond reasoning about rights and empirics. Things that can be known from a thoughtful reflection on reality in light of Christ, which can lead us to better answers about male-female relations. So what I'm going to do today with you is to consider this dizzying gap between what's unfolding all around us, legally and culturally, respecting sex and marriage, to describe the predicament, but then also to spotlight important legal and cultural signs revealing a stratum of apparently inextinguishable good sense, persistent reasonableness, if you will, that might just be enough for us to sink our little claws into and to build on if we allow God, if we allow our faith to assist us to illuminate the current situation. So I'm going to share how I've been working on this to find a foothold, to articulate the gap and a bridge across it, academically, but then also as an activist who's trying to empower women locally to speak about reconnecting sex and marriage and children for their own good, for the good of the children, for the good of men. It's a group that I formed called Women Speak for Themselves. I have brought some brochures. I'm afraid I didn't know there would be quite so many of you. So my colleague, Mary Helen Fiorito, is going to be leaving them. I hope I'm not in your way if I leave them on the front here if people want them, to tell you about the work we're doing. Finally, I'll talk, and believe me, with proper humility, I almost can't believe I'm speaking to a group that involves His Eminence Cardinal Mueller and speaking about anything theologically. But however, I am speaking a little bit about a person with some experience, particularly in communications, which I did for the U.S. bishops to bridge between the academic and the communication, about opportunities for the church to narrow the gap between our current contemporary situation and the church's gorgeous prescriptions for human love. So let me begin by describing our predicament as Catholics who, I'm assuming, are distressed at this gap. And we're distressed for three reasons, okay? Number one, our kids. Period. Enough said. I could stop there, couldn't I? Number two, our understanding from our faith that if we do not get sex and marriage and parenting right, if we don't understand and live these realities, we're not getting God right. We're not understanding who God is as a community of love. We're also missing something essential about who we are and about how we're supposed to love other people. There's this wonderful theologian, I believe he's Russian Orthodox, Vladimir Solovyov, who has a book, The Meaning of Love. And Pope Benedict used to reference this theologian from time to time, who talks about the fact that what is the meaning of human love between man and woman? And he says, you know how you go through life and you see through these eyes in your body and you think, okay, I'm kind of at the center of God's universe. I mean, it's here I am, and that's what I see. And you know how when you fall in love, it's the first time maybe that you've understood that someone else is right there at the center of the universe with you, that you really don't want to go on without them. And then you have children, and you totally know that you're not alone at the center of the universe anymore. So if we don't understand sex and marriage and parenting, there's a chance we won't grasp that, in fact, all of us, who after all are all children, we're all the member of somebody's family, are at the center of the universe together, that we really won't understand human love. And third, maybe we're also concerned about this dizzying gap because too many smart academics have pointed out that family structure, that the difference between having a stable marital family for kids and not, is actually the largest part of the social and economic gap now between the very wealthy and the poor, between black and white Americans, and I'm going to talk a little bit later about the gap between men and women, how men are falling behind in college and in some employment statistics. So to begin, what is this gap, this predicament we find ourselves in? Well, at the ozone layer, I'm going to describe it as a denial of the entire meaning of sexual difference and male-female relations in unity as God has designed it. I mean, that's the ozone layer description. Several kilometers above sea level, I think I would describe it as saying that a huge swath of society, while they seem to be pretty on board with the idea that we're made in God's image and likeness as people who are rational and have free will, they're not actually on board with that other aspect of God's image in which we are made, which is we are constitutively relational. And marriage and family is the first place where we actually understand that, I think, in the way that I'm describing. Then at sea level, we can point to Americans' plain old increasing inability to form and sustain the links between sex, marriage, and kids. Okay? You know this story like you know your mother. But just to bring you a little up to date, I'm going to give you some data on this. Add to all of this, by the way, the fact that Americans are pursuing their current path of unlinking sex and marriage and kids. To paraphrase the words of philosopher Wendell Berry, they're pursuing this ridiculous path while calling what's actually falling apart flying. All the while, of course, hurtling toward a collision with the ground. Wham, right? But they're still calling it flying, even though we're just falling. Americans call it freedom, freedom to be ourselves. The family law that I teach at Scalia Law at George Mason University says it's our Supreme Court declared substantive due process rights toward sexual expression completely indifferent to children or to marriage. That's our constitutional right, according to the court. So let me speak first a little bit more precisely about the sea level predicament where sex and marriage are concerned, the gap that we can't pick up a newspaper without being acquainted with. First, today we have a record share of Americans who have never married, the highest in history who have never married. From 1 in 5 adults over 25 in 1960 who never married, now it's 1 in 10. So, you know, if this trend continued, we'd go from a 90% married country to 80%, but a lot of people think this trend is picking up speed. It'll be closer to 70, 75%. So you're looking at almost 1 in 3 who won't be entering into marriage. That's a different kind of society. We also see alarming differences between socioeconomic groups. So people who have a college degree or who come from a stable family structure are far more likely to marry. But rates of marriage are sharply declining among the working poor. And it is also creating racial rifts that it should not. We are seeing that black and white Americans are not going to be sharing the same family experience as we ought, and as I think people desire on the part of all. We have 36% of black Americans who have never been married over age 25. That's only 16% among white Americans. And now, according to the Pew Forum, which is a pretty good source of data, 50% of Americans say it doesn't matter if America becomes less of a married or marital parenthood society. It just doesn't matter. And of course, what marriage is also changing. You may have remembered there was this great bulk of research in the 90s and early 2000s from some marvelous sociologists, whether it's Charles Murray in his book Coming Apart, Andrew Cherlin, who had been no conservative at Johns Hopkins, or Catherine Eden and Maria Kafalis, no conservatives, pointing out that marriage had become a capstone for men and women. They perceived it as an accomplishment the attaining of a more or less enforceable trust from a person of the opposite sex once your money and your job and some other life goals, maybe after you'd saved for the destination wedding, maybe after you'd had a kid or two, was all accomplished. It was no longer a foundation upon which to build a good life, a life of solid relations with kin and extended kin, and then beyond the family as your family unit relating to the larger society. This unit built by two into one together and over time. That was already being chronicled as gone as a concept in the 90s, and now even radically more so. But then came the Supreme Court same-sex marriage opinion, Obergefell. And now, Justice Kennedy, and may I say, just a little sarcastically, 4 other justices who somehow did not write a concurring opinion in one of the landmark opinions in American law, because I think they were like too embarrassed by Justice Kennedy's purple prose. I mean, his opinion, Justice Roberts had it best. He said it's not law. It doesn't even pretend to be law. It just is what was in the head of a justice about what he thought liberty as a word in the Constitution currently required. So now what they are saying is that marriage is no longer anything to do with children, but in fact, states are forbidden, just think about this, they are forbidden from saying in a legal manner that procreation, or procreation by parents who stay in a relationship with those children, is anything special. I mean, that's Obergefell. States are forbidden from regarding either procreation or linking children with the parents who made them as a special good. That is not permissible anymore. And while we're talking about marriage, of course, let's talk cohabitation. According to the foremost authority in the US, Scott Stanley, about 70% of people are cohabiting before marriage now. And it's likely to hit 80% in warp speed. It has increased by 82% by women over 23 in the last 10 years, okay? That's a lot. And cohabitation, of course, is the biggest driver of non-marital births. 4 out of 10 births in the US are outside of marriage. Cohabitation is the place where that's happening. This despite the fact that we know it's highly predictive of divorce. And even more so predictive is multiple cohabitations. Now, do you want to hear that data? Current figures indicate that 44% of people who are currently cohabiting have had 2 or more cohabitations. And 20% of people who are not cohabiting but either married or single in the United States have already lived with 2 or more people. That's a huge threat to marriage. And of course we know that children of cohabiting couples are more likely by a dramatic amount to experience their parents' dissolution. And then of course, very often the mother will move into a relationship with a male who's not the father. I wrote an article about this in a very lovely, a very highly regarded academic blog about this, and I got the saddest letter I've ever gotten from a grandfather whose daughter had a child, then moved in with a man who was not the child's father, who killed the child. And it is, if you look at the national statistics on the death of children, it's one of the largest reasons is death by a non-related male in the household. And the father said when the police came to help him, they said, why didn't anybody tell your daughter that this is the #1 reason why children are dying in our jurisdiction? Because it's not politically correct to speak about this particular choice as threatening to children. We also have the social fact of the family structure gap, whether it's Kay Heimowitz or Charles Murray. Family structure gap, as I mentioned, is this huge factor in the gap between incomes and wealth of Americans and between races. Interestingly, according to Raj Chetty, I think he's here at Stanford now, he was at Harvard before, they're beginning to think that the family structure gap is the reason for the gap between men's and women's job and college performance now. He had this data set where he was able to follow children prenatally, their APGAR scores on birth, their preschool, through school, all the way up to their mid-20s. And by the mid-20s, the guys had fallen behind their sisters. They were brother-sister pairs of single mothers. The boys had fallen behind their sisters before kindergarten and never caught up. And he's not the only one. David O'Toole and a couple of others thinking about mothers' different relationships with girls, boys' lack of a father's role model, girls looking at their mother and saying, she does everything. Mom does it all. She brings in the money. She raises me. She takes care of it. And maybe there's a gap there. And of course, you've probably seen the reports, New York Times 2 weeks ago, Americans are now having record low numbers of children, below replacement rates. And this, we know, will go lower with millennials. We also know we are having more people have sexual encounters with more partners who are not their spouse and fiancé. You know, America was not a country where most people went to marriage as virgins, even, you know, in the middle of the 20th century. But the person they slept with was the person they were engaged to. Or the person they got engaged to. And now you just have a variety of partners who are, we don't call it premarital sex anymore. Let's just put it that way. The word for it in the sociological literature is non-marital sex, or excuse me, non-relationship sex. Non-relationship sex. Mark Regnerus chronicles it in his book Cheap Sex, where he talks about almost 1 out of every 3 encounters on a college campus being prior to a date. It's the day you met the person. So the current legal academy's view of all this, well, the above is fine or good, so long as there's consent, right? That sex unrelated to children and indifferent to marriage is, after all, a constitutional right. Birth control will eventually fix it. It hasn't yet. In fact, rates of out-of-wedlock pregnancy have gone up with federal spending on birth control since the 1970s. Even rates of unintended pregnancy, rates of abortion, rates of sexually transmitted infections, they've all gone up. And I could go into the economic theories. Janet Yellen has one of the best papers on it as to why this was bound to happen, believe it or not. Risk compensation, prisoner's dilemma, all the economic theories showed that this was going to happen. And I will say it's most Republicans as well as Democrats think if we just insert enough IUDs into these young poor women that eventually we will slow this down. The family law establishment in the U.S. thinks that constitutionalized same-sex marriage is just a logical development of the separation of sex marriage and parenthood that we saw already. I was on a panel at Yale with a guy, he used to do, I think he was sort of the gay law program at one of the California universities here. He's now family law at Yale. And he said to me, I don't know why you're complaining about same-sex marriage. It's, you know, your lot paved the way. You know, you're the ones who separated sex marriage and kids. We just said it's a fait accompli. That means we're in. Family law establishment also thinks cohabitation should be protected, perhaps even to the level of marriage with the same rights and obligations. I'm writing a paper this summer against a stream of papers that said cohabitation should be treated as a protected status, like race, and it should always trump religious freedom when a landlord or an employer is not happy that a person wants to cohabit on their premises or sign a contract with a Christian or Catholic university that says, I will model a certain behavior and then sue them when they fire them for cohabiting and win, okay? The idea that parenting by contract is fine is very much emerging as acceptable in family law. This is particularly changed so that same-sex couples will be able to contract surrogate mothers for children. Surrogacy, you know, it's been a problem for a while, but some states had still held on to some adoption-like protections. For surrogacy, the mother could change her mind within a certain amount of time. The court wouldn't put your name on the birth certificate right away. The new Uniform Parentage Act, which interestingly was partially drafted by one of the women I'm fighting on this cohabitation front as a scholar, has basically said that, you know, let's just make it easier and easier for same-sex couples to contract for children. And that law is now rapidly being adopted around the United States. Children are a straight-up benefit. It's what you get when you get a same-sex marriage license. And in a case that probably not many of you noticed, after Obergefell last summer in the Pavon case, the Supreme Court said, well, you know, yeah, state, you have to put the same-sex partner's name on the birth certificate because you would do it for an opposite-sex couple, so you must. And they said, we promise them all the benefits of marriage. Getting to be the legal parent of a child is one of those benefits. So having looked at sort of the current situation in the law, I want to talk about signs that are good. Signs that at the very least, we see that people are not calling what's happening flying all the time. They're not calling it progress all the time. And I want to tell you, as someone who came into the pro-life movement in the late 80s, when if I, you know, would be flying to something for the U.S. bishops to speak on it, and someone had asked me what I do, I'm like, I'm in communications. And why did I do that? Because I just didn't want to have like a screaming fight in the seat next to me. You know, over the years I got braver. So pro-life, you know. And then eventually it was like, you know what? You're not gonna like hit me on a plane or stage a scene here. We made progress. In the 90s, it went from being a pure choice to, well, it's a tragic choice, or it should be rare. You know, we made some progress, and now look at where we are against all the odds. Nobody thought we would live to see the possibility of the fifth justice with as much of the country on our side as we have, okay? So we shouldn't be blind to progress here. We shouldn't. We have to see what we have preserved, not only on the abortion issue, but what we have kept alive on these issues of sex and marriage during this time. Today, we are seeing that Americans, for instance, are not willing to adopt the claim that the sexual revolution was a complete hands-down win, okay? There's discussion to the contrary. We see growing sense that Americans are suffering new levels of loneliness, even anomie, the loss of a sense of social purpose, okay? And that the unbearable lightness of sex and the fragility of families is part of this. We are seeing an agreement between the right and left. Brookings and the American Enterprise Institute come together to say that family instability is a chief cause of children's misery, and that we ought to straight out encourage people to have marital children and to stay together. Okay? We see the decline of sex among girls under 20 who are unmarried. Now, some of it is because they say you have to be beautiful to have sex, because Facebook says you have to be beautiful. But some of it is because they can't stand the unbearable lightness. We see the widespread and continuing discussion, even in the New York Times, of the harms associated with cohabitation. We see that people are realizing that kids are hitting rock bottom with suicide and opioid rates. And we can see that that is actually, in the empirical literature, tied to family structure. We're also seeing articles showing that what has been reaped from generations of divorce. And by the way, gray divorce is doubled. Thank you, baby boomers. Sorry, we can all look at one another. I'm the tail end of the baby boom. Gray divorce, that is us, has doubled, right, in recent years. And they're saying that this is causing a great dilemma. Kids don't want to care for someone they're angry about. They don't want to care for the step-parent. They're fighting with the other stepchildren about which one of them is going to take care of who. And there's a discussion about this being one of the harms from divorce. There's also an acknowledgement that state programs aren't cutting it. I wrote a recent book about sort of the government support for sexual expression divorced from children and marriage. I'm going to stick on the table with the Women Speak for Themselves stuff, some flyers if you're interested in the book. And in it, I document, and I only use Obama-era agency evaluations, Centers for Disease Control, you know, Beltway Bandit evaluators, Mathematica, all the others, who are not using anybody who anyone would put the word conservative next to. I only use the data from the CDC, from Obama-era agencies, et cetera. And they are reporting that these programs cannot compensate for family structure. In the words of the left-leaning think tank Brookings, quote, while interventions that raise income, increase parental time availability, provide alternative services, or other in-kind resources would benefit children, these are likely to be at best only partial substitutes for marriage. The advantages of marriage for children are the sum of many, many parts. Okay? That's Brookings. Okay? Children are also speaking up about the meaning of the loss of their biological parents. Okay? Anonymous Us and other databases where children are saying, you know, I'm sorry I came home with the t-shirt, my daddy's name is Donor. I'd sure like to know who he is. Right? Hookup books, and I had to read all 12 of them to write my book. They always start with women saying, this is pretty empowering, it's pretty adventurous, it's pretty cool. But they end up with women with their head in their hands at the health clinic at their college saying, I'm lonely, I have a sexually transmitted infection. I thought the sex would lead to at least a first date. I thought I would get a text. The acts are degrading. There's the quotes from the women. One woman said, you know, I tried so hard to copy the porn star. She said, I thought, if I don't shake when I hold this particular position, he'll think I'm as good as the women he sees in porn. But she said, now sex is just homework and I'm done. And this is what you read in these books. There's a dozen of them or more. It's a sign of hope that maybe there's a hitting bottom. There's a backlash to porn now, which I don't have to tell you about, the Fight the New Drug and other groups. The Me Too movement, realizing, okay, the logical conclusion of an environment where sex has no weight. And I want to also point out something that maybe you haven't linked. The huge growth in movements, in hashtag activism, in bumper stickers, in T-shirts, which are straining toward a desire for solidarity. Okay, you got to see this. I know that many of these things also include statements which include positions against a lot of things we love, right? Marriage, life. But see the straining toward a desire for human connection here in the bumper stickers that say coexist, choose civility, welcome and have fair and friendly immigration policies, Black Lives Matter. There is a desire to be a society that loves diversity and equality next to one another. There's good there. There's a desire, okay? And I hope that we can see that these are, in a way, a reflection of the radical need for human solidarity and an affirmation of our fundamental interdependence and need to love, okay? Which is a message that we can endorse, right? Where do you get the first message about equality and diversity next to each other? Male, female, equal, different. I don't know, the first part of Genesis, right? Who's the better expositor of that than ourselves? The family is the school of love, which means it's the school of solidarity, equality across differences. Finally, I want to tell you about my academic and activist work, because I'm giving my 40 minutes here, which I'm hoping to take even though we stopped, so I'll be done with you in like another 12 minutes, okay, I promise. Keeping you sort of on time. I want to tell you about my academic and activist work attempting to close this gap, okay, and why my approach isn't good enough yet, and why the church. I teach at a state university, right? Scalia Law. Try wearing that on a T-shirt on a plane, too. I tell you that. I need like a protection society sometimes. Anyway, I've used two methods academically in order to try and work to close the gap. The first is I read all these family law theorists, and I say to myself, what's their anthropology of male-female relationships, sex, and marriage? Who do they, it's usually between the lines, but who do they say people are, okay? And then I realized that what they're saying is we're self-maximizing monads who, you know, if we want a baby, we'll have a baby, we don't need a man. If we're, and it's always about women, you know, it's, and women being able to be by themselves. And then what I do is I show that anthropology won't get you where they want to go, which is love and solidarity and care. They think that's okay because the state will fill it in. But we know that even, again, Obama-era evaluations of the state programs will say the state has not, and it appears cannot get you there, okay? And after I point out their anthropology, and I say this is what it looks like, then I try to go into both qualitative and quantitative studies about what people actually say they want. So for instance, I spent 18 months looking at all the government programs on sex education. And they posit that women are self-maximizing monads who, if you say to them, here's a long-acting contraception, here's some information about getting a good education, getting a good job, you're going to be on your own, don't worry, everything's going to be fine. Those programs fail. They fail across the board. What programs have succeeded? Programs about relationships. And programs that treat these young women and men as gifted givers, and then capacitate them to give. So the only program that was in the government sort of sex ed, youth development house that worked was the one that sent poor young people to work with people who had even more troubles than they did. For many, many, many years, that's where the teen pregnancy rates went down. Or programs that talked about relationships they were made for. And then I conclude my scholarship by saying, your programs won't work because your anthropology is wrong. People are gifted givers, and whatever the government says to them has to be about capacitating them to give that gift. You're telling them they're lone monads who need to maximize themselves. My second strategy is to undo the empirics of their claims, to go in and say, you say, for instance, on the contraception mandate, that free contraception is the key to women's freedom. You say it's good for their health. You say it's going to lower abortion. You say it's going to make them more free in all this myriad of ways. And I went into the government's report that underlay the contraception mandate, and I looked at every study in their footnotes. I looked at the studies that those studies relied on, and I completely unraveled it empirically. Let me just give you an example in case you... I think it was Senator Feinstein who kept quoting that women pay 58% more for health care than men because of contraception. And she quoted that a million times, and I just kept tracing and tracing and tracing where that came from. It turned out women spend more than men over a lifetime of health care because we, ladies, you won't be surprised about this, we go to the doctors more. How many times you say to my husband, I think you might be having a heart attack. Could you just get that checked out? No, I got something to, women go to the doctors more. Here's another shocker. They live longer, so we go to the doctor more. And the other major cost we have that men don't have? Having babies. Okay? So in any event, there's no basis whatsoever to eventually where her citation came down to. So I completely undo them empirically. And in fact, I've never had anybody come back and respond to my contraception mandate undoing. Actually, the Trump administration took about 30 paragraphs of my law review article on that, and it became the rationale for the overturning of the mandate. So it was useful somehow. Thank you. So, a few things about this. First of all, yes, my stuff's empirically sound. Yes, I think I have them on the anthropology. But I'm still not winning. I hate it when I'm not winning. I just cannot tell you how much I hate that. There's not wide enough acknowledgement of things we know to be true, right? When I talk about children's rights, people are thinking, well, yeah, children, great political, talking point, but they don't actually vote and they don't contribute to political campaigns, so we're not actually going to get to them. Sometimes I think maybe I'm speaking about individual rights and empirics as if that's the winning argument. But it's not true. The winning argument is relationship. The winning argument, the whole sexual revolution was about breaking down relationship. Everything we do has to be about building it up. So let me talk a little bit about what Catholics might do on this, and then what I'm doing at my group, Women Speak for Themselves, in order to try and assist the church on this. No one understands more radically the constitutiveness of relationality to the human being, at our being in the image of a Trinitarian God, and on the significance of marriage and family for learning how to love equally across differences, and to no matter who the person is. No one speaks more movingly about the fact of our obligation, all of us as Good Samaritans, to attend to the person strewn in our path, who ends up being the kid in the bathroom, the elderly mother who needs our help, and then beyond that to extended kin, and then to other people who are somebody's parents, and everyone is somebody's child. Or in my favorite words of Pope Benedict in Deus Caritas Est, nobody better understands our obligation to give every person that look of love they crave. That totally revolutionized my life. But our language, I think, is too foreign. I think if you utter the words unitive and procreative sex to anybody but the Catholic cognoscenti, then they will respond to you by saying, well, either you're babbling or you've just proved to me that you are totally irrelevant. You are nothing more than the morals police with archaic rules and archaic language, and you don't understand my current situation. I came to learn the hard way, despite being academically oriented and practicing law, that communications is not a lesser art than the academic or intellectual work of coming up with the good ideas. Okay, it ain't. We are not without some examples of the church doing some wonderful communications already. But what I'm going to say is I think we need more. So we have, for instance, Benedict in Deus Caritas Est. You've got to read that encyclical. I mean, when he talks early on about the church is being accused of, quote, blowing the whistle on sex when it's about to become divine. He then says, hey, is the exaltation of our body as a biological tool for us just to put to use, is that making you happy? How that's working out for you? He says, or has it actually made us hate our bodies? And then he says, everybody says, oh, it was so great in the old days, the temple prostitutes, the divine madness of biology and sex as a key to happiness. He goes, has anybody actually consulted with the temple prostitutes about whether that made them happy? Or was it just exploitation? Okay, he's got some great language. Francis is in his opening address to the Humanum Conference that many of you may remember being there or seeing in Rome several years ago. He says when we address young people, we have to say, don't give in to the environment of the temporary. Be revolutionaries with the courage to seek true and lasting love. Don't just be like everyone else, okay? What do I think I am seeing here? I think I am seeing that one of the crucial methods we have to adopt, and here I'm stealing boldly from Luigi Giussani, someone who Pope Benedict loved and the founder of Communion and Liberation, by saying, don't deny human desires, but say to them, you don't even know how deep your desires go. You're not desiring big enough. You think you want to have sex to get a text or a date. You really want someone who loves you forever. You really do. You think this is the way to get there, but you can't get there from here. So we start by affirming their smaller and temporary desires as really just a little bit evidence of our desire for a love that is there for us, and ultimately our desire for the love of an infinite God. We frame these desires in response to their questions, their sadness, their loneliness, their discontent. Okay, we say, I see. We say, I see the gap between where you're living and where you want to go. And I see that you're asking really fundamental questions about where we stand, and can we get you there? Do we value sex? Do we think it doesn't matter at all? Do we think it's icky? Is marriage even desirable anymore? Is it possible? Even if I can grasp that the church is against abortion, how can you possibly fail to understand that contraception is a great good, they say to us? I'm not getting you. I'm unhappy, but I can't get to where you are. I believe we have to give plain spoken answers. We have to talk when it comes to things like contraception by saying, hey, if you dissociate sex from even the idea that this is the one place where, call it what you like, God, nature, chose to put babies, do you realize what you're doing? You're saying that this act, which creates babies and is associated with love and this unity, is not? Do you realize what that does to the relationship between you and the man? It severs tomorrow. You're not going to get a text tomorrow. You're not going to have love tomorrow. You're not going to have family, kin, children, marriage. Contraception severed sex from tomorrow, and that's why we oppose it. On cohabitation, we say, do you really think you can get to security in relationship from living with someone in a relationship of testing, from keeping your body, from putting your body in a complete unity that says we could create an eternal soul, but separating your money, your time, maybe you're not even faithful to one another? Do you really think that keeping your distance while doing something that could create an eternal bond between the two of you doesn't actually make it easier for you to break relations? Doesn't that kind of make you a hypocrite? And I don't mean that as an insult, I just mean it as an ontological fact. If you want to be a responsible person and a responsible parent, doesn't that mean you actually have to think about sex, because sex creates family structure? And family structure is the source of a child's deepest happiness or unhappiness? Don't you think you ought to think about that? I could go on with these types of examples, but I want to add one final thought on the Catholic contribution before closing with a few remarks on my activist work. People being tossed about by the world's prescription for happiness and romance are actually afraid. They appear sophisticated and blasé. I know, I got 20-somethings, I have teens, I see it at the dinner table, right? But this is not my actual experience of them. They know there is a dizzying gap between what their mind and soul seeks and what's on offer. It's our job to tell them, you're right, the gap is huge. It's dizzy to look across it. And you can't get across it on what the world has to offer. But if you listen to the Catholic framing of the reality of human interdependence and the meaning of sex and marriage, you can get there. Be not afraid. And I could do a whole other talk, and I'm sure everyone here, Amazing Parish and other groups who work in that, can talk about the need for parishes and couples to live in a way where a young person looks at you and they say, I'm afraid of marriage, I'm afraid of waiting, I'm afraid of not having sex because I won't get a date. They need to look at you and say, okay, I'm not afraid anymore. I'm not afraid. Okay, that's how we bridge it. So, final words, I am trying to help women especially, because women's sort of going along with an entirely not woman-friendly sex and marriage marketplace is another definition for the sexual revolution. So I am trying to help women in particular communicate more often and more skillfully about these matters in an effort I call Women Speak for Themselves. And again, we'll put the material out in the front row here right after this talk. In the contraception mandate, I did a letter that said, sex without marriage and kids is not women's sine qua non of freedom. Jon Stewart made fun of it on the, what was that, the Nightly Show, whatever. It got ridiculed terribly in various places. It got celebrated in various places. I ended up with 77,000 women on a database that, thanks to the Chiaroscuro Foundation, I was able to database and begin to communicate with these women. They're saying, give me the language to talk about this. Tell me how women are being immiserated, that is, made miserable, in the sex and marriage marketplace where sex has no weight, where contraception makes sex have no tomorrow associated with it. So I began to send them emails. I began to do fact sheets. I began to write Supreme Court amicus briefs. We did it in the Little Sisters case, and shout out to Sister Constance here. We did it in the Archdiocese of the Zubik versus Birdwell case. Is that Erie, Pittsburgh? Pittsburgh, thank you. We've filed briefs on behalf of tens of thousands of women. I bring 25 of them to Washington every year and give them first-rate 2-day media training. We are now doing online media training, and we're about to take our materials and send them monthly to parishes or Catholic groups or anyone who wants them about the how-to. I live, eat, and breathe this stuff, which is an incredible embarrassment to my children, in case you're wondering. And I just want to say that on record, and I'm sorry. I seem to have a vocation just to wonder to figure this out and to fix it. And again, did I mention I like to win? There is a JD after my name. We've had some big wins that Women Speak for Themselves. We've been in the top half of the New York Times against the limited nature of the Women's March. Glamour magazine has had to fight back with us. We had the ultimate Little Sisters of the Poor, women college students, all women on the front of the Supreme Court about contraception. Catch that. The third rail. And I'm still alive. I'm not electrocuted to death. The Wall Street Journal called it the most effective all-women's protest they'd ever seen, the rally of the court on that topic. So I just want to emphasize that there's hope here. I want to offer my womenspeakforthemselves.com for you to get involved. I send like one email a month. Everything I send out is for free. It's for stealing. It's copyright denied. Just use it in order to make further headway on this. And I want for you in whatever secular endeavors you have, but also the natural constituency, of course, that we have is the church. Because whatever I can say empirically, she can illuminate it till it's absolutely gorgeous. So thank you very much.